Thank you, Tiffany. We'll be welcome to everyone joining the webinar this evening. We want to go through a lot of interesting areas and take questions so it can be meaningful for you. I just want to start off by appreciating CPA Australia in making this webinar available. Okay, we're going to cover through, we're going to go back to February early when there was panic buying. We're going to talk about the supply of PPE, the demand for PPE, specifically face masks. We're going to talk about bottlenecks in the supply chain and long-term impacts of the trade war and COVID-19. What is very important here is to focus on the specific challenges that global supply chains are facing, not to mention the most important one at the moment is the fact that we cannot actually go and visit factories in most developing countries. But let's get into the different parts, and really happy to take your questions, and I'll look in the chat room as you ask. First of all, early on this year, we noticed that stores were drying up with certain consumables because, well, what we learned was supermarkets, they don't keep a lot of stock, and they have a specific supply chain that is different from what you would normally see in other consumables. For example, supermarkets are always restocking every night. They only carry 2 or 3 days inventory for most of their items. So it's not unusual for supermarket shelves to be empty as a result of some peak in a demand as a result of some event like what happened in February and March, and still happening in different countries today. Okay, so this is not unusual, and that's the way supermarkets operate. They're on a very thin margin, and so inventory costs them money, and so they just work on a restock on an evening basis. You know, people stocking up their shelves every evening, and the supermarket is operating. So they're not designed for panic buying. That's the big thing we learned from that, but it just laid bare to everyone that we could see this. What is really interesting, if we go and have a look and what did we see in China in terms of what happened in February, then in March, like, you know, going into February, everything was closed down in China and things started to open up. But as early as the start of January, you had tens of thousands of factories starting to get into the PPE manufacturing, mask manufacturing in particular. And someone told me, no, it's not 28,000 factories, it's 35,000 factories. But at the end of December last year, there was less than 10,000 factories making PPE, specifically masks, in China. So there's a 3 times increase in the making of masks. And so you've got to expect that a percentage, probably a large percentage of these factories, really do not know how to make good quality masks. And it wasn't until February when the China government decided to introduce regulations that requiring all factories to have a license to sell domestically before they export, that they start clamping down on the factories that really weren't making high quality masks. But N95 masks were the ones that were really in demand, and what happened was that, you know, the normal demand or the normal supply was 200,000 being made a day. That went up to over 1.6 million per day. The daily production of ordinary masks soared from 10 million to 116 million 4 weeks later, you know, by the end of February. That's a 12 times increase. And so there were good companies that were already in business making PPE, specifically masks, but there are many newer entrants that entered into it, and they did a good job, but most of them did not do a good job because good material, specifically melt-blown material, was difficult to find, and more about that in a minute. Okay, here's an example, and this is a personal example. Back in September 2019, I bought a packet of 20 N95 masks, and that cost me 119 ringgit. And so, you know, 7 months later, I went to the same store in Lazada in Malaysia, and it's cost me nearly 3 times as much for 20 N95 masks. And so obviously when you get these gyrations in terms of supply and demand, you're going to get huge changes in the prices for various masks. What does the this problem looked like on the ground. Well, at the time, you go back to February and March when there was a lot of uncertainty about how bad this pandemic was going to be. People were running around thinking, okay, we've got to get masks. We've got to get tens of thousands of them. Just every state in the US were looking for masks. It wasn't centralized buying from the US. Every state was out going to China trying to buy masks just for their own state's needs. And what they were told at that time was, oh, you need to put the money down first before we do anything. Now, anyone would tell you in any supply chain management practice with working with China or any other developing country is you don't put down always 100% down at the start. You may put down 30% down with the factories so they can get the materials to start making your product, and then 30% at FOB and maybe 40% in your country, or 70% at FOB stage, that's at shipping the container level stage of the process. Well, what happened in February and March was, okay, if you wanted even 1,000 masks, you had to pay 100% up front. What people did not know what was occurring, especially buyers from overseas, was that people rushed into the China factories, there are a lot of middlemen, and they dumped down millions of dollars of the factories to buy out their mask making capacity for the next 4, 5, 6 weeks. And so then they on-sold them to governments, various bodies in developed nations, France, Canada, Europe, USA, England, Australia, for double, triple the amount that they originally paid. And it wasn't the factories that were selling to the developed countries, it were these middlemen. And so we didn't know who the factory was, and we didn't really have one. We didn't have a sense of, well, where's the quality control? And it wasn't until that Europe and Canada and other countries started to complain about the delivery of poor batches of poor quality masks that we started to have a greater awareness of what is going on with, then we realized that, oh, the middlemen are in here and they've bought out the factory capacity, and the factories are, they're already making for the middleman, they're not making directly for the overseas buyer. Wow. And so, so this was what was going on. It's like cowboy land, because everything was new for a lot of people that never have purchased masks before, especially local governments in the USA. There was one case with the Illinois government. They had to work through an agent and actually send cash to a bank account in China to get a factory to commit to making a batch of masks. And they were talking about, they were sending, they were talking about more than $1 million to a bank account in China, just so they can get a factory to commit to make masks for Illinois. And so, things like this was going on in March, and, things have settled down now to some degree, but this is what was happening. Okay, and as I just mentioned, it wasn't until that Europe, USA, Australia, different bodies, Netherlands, started complaining about certain batches of masks turning up poor quality, that we started to put a greater magnifying glass on the actual supply, the manufacture and supply of masks in China. Well, not just China, because China was making at the end of last year 50% of PPE in the world, but by the end of March they were making 75%. That's how the capacity just changed overnight in a matter of months. But it wasn't until that the batches of poor quality masks were being shipped and they were found, and that word got back, and then the China government said, well, this is not good enough, and they put in practices to make sure that the factories were properly regulated. Now, I'll talk about that shortly. Okay, so just summarizing what was going on back in as early as February, the biggest challenge were the lack of raw materials and the lack of labor, because mid-January into February, China was on lockdown, and so people went back for Chinese New Year, and they could get back, and then they weren't able to come back after Chinese New Year, which, and so we're going into the middle of February, and it wasn't until the end of February into March that there was more freedom for factory workers to go back to factories. So even though factories had orders or had money to make masks, they didn't have the capacity in terms of the people working in the factory to get the product out and shipped. And so it may have been just one or two people, two people that were missing in the factory, and that was enough to slow down the actual production, the capacity that China had during the end of February into March. Now, in March, what happened, what we started to realize was that, wow, that was one stage, but globally, airlines started to shut down their capacity because countries were restricting people moving in and out, but they started imposing quarantines when you traveled into a country. US started banning flights from China and particular other countries. And suddenly by middle of March, the biggest challenge was, wow, passenger airlines around the world, like at any one time in full flight, there's 500,000 people in the air at any one time. Well, that basically nearly went to zero by the middle of March to the end of March. But what we've got to realize is that passenger airlines carry half the air freight for the total air freight around the world. And so if passenger airlines are grounded, and we're talking about 28,000 of them about, then that's 28,000 bodies of aircraft multiplied by half. That's half air freight capacity that no longer exists. And so suddenly people, countries started to think, well, how do we get masks out of China? And even some countries started chartering aircraft going into China to collect masks to bring back to their country. So that was early March. That was the first time that was a huge capacity bottleneck that occurred. Then later in March, there was regulations that were put in by China saying that, okay, if you're a factory in China and you're making masks for export, you need to be certified to make masks for domestic consumption in China. And that was an additional regulation that factories had to comply with before they could export masks. And so that slowed down even more the supply of masks to the world. Wow, so that was March. Then when we went into April, the price of air freight basically went up about 5 or 6 times. And you're talking about, less than $3 to $5 a kilo to $18 per kilo in some cases. So we're talking about 3 times or more increase in air freight. And it was just so hard by the time we got to April to predict the cost of air freight. And you had a lot of stock backlog in ports in China, airports and shipping ports, because there was shipping constraints at the same time as well. And so by the time we got in the middle of April, then we got to the end of April, 10th of April, then China government said, okay, all exports of PPE need to be inspected by customs. Now, we know that doesn't exactly happen, but the requirement that they have to be ready for inspection was enough to actually put another bottleneck on the supply of masks to be exported out of China. Wow, so we can see this was going on in February, March and April, and what you'll find and what's continuing into May and then June is still the biggest, I think the biggest bottleneck now is melt-blown material, which is it's the middle layer of a 3-layer mask. Melt-blown, you buy it in tons. So 1 ton of melt-blown, like a big giant toilet roll, ginormous, 1 ton of melt-blown can make 700,000 masks. Now that is actually that's in limited quantities. And so not all factories have access to that melt-blown material. And when they can get access to it, there's only so much that they can make. And it's not like that there's endless supply of melt-blown material for the demand around the world. This is going to be continuing not until they get a vaccine, this is going to be continuing for many years to come. It's probably a new reality in terms of a new production sector, that is manufacture of PPE, and a dominant portion of manufacture of PPE for the next 3 to 5 years will be masks, and that's just a new reality. Okay, so let's broaden my discussion from, okay, this is what we saw in terms of the masks, the challenge and the gyrations between supply and demand, the bottlenecks, the problems with quality and things like that. What is the bigger picture for global supply chains, specifically for SMEs, specifically for multinationals? And I've got this diagram here I'd like to take you through that summarizes a lot of the issues very cogently, and happy to take questions on this as we go forward. Number one, immediately, for the first 6 months of this year, just huge uncertainty. Like the trade war created so much uncertainty anyway, beginning mid-2018 and 2019, into 20, there's already enough uncertainty with the trade war. But there was just even increased uncertainty brought about by this COVID. But just talking about the trade war alone, that created a lot of uncertainty for SMEs, small and medium enterprises. Specifically, they are not the first type of company to have a portfolio of suppliers across many countries. Take, for example, GoPro, the manufacturer of GoPro. Okay, so they were making GoPro cameras in China for the last 6, 7, 8 years, but now they've moved out of China into Southeast Asia, Thailand, I think. And that was only recently in the last 6 to 12 months. Crocs has now moved out of China and gone to Southeast Asia. A vacuum cleaner, a robotic vacuum cleaner manufacturer popular around the world, they moved out of China and then they moved to Malaysia. So you've got the biggest strategic decision for SMEs is, okay, if we're going to move out of China, it's more likely we have to move the whole factory out of China and move it to another country. And the challenge for SMEs is that, and I talked to many of them, you just don't move out of China for one factor alone. There was this Swiss manufacturer of these international power outlets that when you go on holiday and you go to another country and you have to plug in this adapter so you can charge your iPhone, so you can charge all your other paraphernalia, you bring it with you. The Swiss manufacturer was in China. They moved out of Guangzhou to Thailand for 3 reasons. One was labour costs kept on going up in China. For the last 6 years, it's been going up 15% per year. So that's a doubling of labour costs over 6 years. Also, they're worried about under-the-table money for logistics going across provincial borders in China, and also they're worried about protecting IP because they had over 2 million hits on their website, and most of the hits were coming out of China, and they're not even selling their product in China. So there was obviously other suppliers in China looking on the website for designs to, kind of copy, but just to try and mimic the success that this company is having in that sector. And so they moved for 3 reasons. When they went to Bangkok, I was talking to the CEO 6 months later, and I said, how did your Bangkok move go? And he said, well, not long after we moved, the Bangkok government put up the minimum wage by 40%. And so the big thing I actually tell the SMEs, yes, you can move to another country, but labour costs are going to go up everywhere, anywhere over time. Malaysia's labour costs are about the same as Shenzhen now, all right? It's not like they're cheaper. Vietnam's will be the same as Shenzhen in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time anyway. So it's, don't just go for one factor alone. You move to another country for 2, 3 factors, but never just one factor alone. And, this is what you've got to bring into your strategic decision. Okay, so that, that's the big thing, that's the big challenge that's facing SMEs. But if we look at the multinationals, they can take a greater portfolio approach to this problem, because for most cases they have a portfolio of countries from which they are sourcing from. They might have a factory in Turkey to supply Europe. They may have a factory in Mexico to supply USA. They may have factories in China to supply more higher-end skilled workers, like VF Corp has, the world's largest manufacturer of jeans. There's small 5-pocket variety is manufactured in Mexico and shipped across the US, but they're more higher-end designs. They have to ship to the US. They get manufactured in China. Why? Because they can get those designs made very quickly with the higher skilled staff they have in their factories in China. So, multinationals take more of a portfolio approach to the location of suppliers, and so therefore they're forced to think about, okay, if I'm going to move out of China, I'm going to redistribute what I source from China, maybe from 30% of my total sourcing down to 20% of my total sourcing. They're not going to go to zero in China, and one of the big reasons that they're not going to go to zero in China is that by 2023, if not earlier, or maybe 1 year later, but as soon as 2023, China's consumer market is going to be the largest in the world, and in some product segments, it is already the largest in the world. And so a multinational does not want to restrict its exposure to China just because it gets lobbied with a tariff when they ship into the USA goods that are manufactured in China because of the trade war. Because in the long term, the actual goods they sell in China may outweigh what they are selling in the USA. So, these are larger strategic considerations that multinationals bring to the table. And in the face of uncertainty created by the trade war, uncertainty created by COVID-19. The other thing, like number 2 I've got here, and it kind of summarizes what I said with the example with that Swiss manufacturer. Don't move on one factor alone. And that's, very, very huge advice I give to SMEs. But for the multinationals, they're going to focus much more on the number 3, that is to stay, because number 1, they want to drive innovation and change. Multinationals who are already established in China have very strong roots in China. For example, Volkswagen has been there for 35 years. IKEA has been there for more than a dozen years. S. Oliver, Giorgio Armani, and a lot of S&P 500 companies are very well established in China, but they have a very strong supply network in China. IKEA's major manufacturing around the world is in China and still is in China because they're continuously working with those factories to continually bring new designs to the market. And so they have very strong relationships and roots with those factories that they're not going to move just because of cost alone or just because of the uncertainty created by trade war and COVID-19. So, this is why companies are staying in China. They want to consolidate the supply base. They want to have greater second-tier supply chain transparency, and they want to have, and they've got the virtual design teams, and this collaborative partnerships are worth 10 times more than these trade war politics and COVID-19, which brings a new set of reality for particular sectors, but not all sectors of the supply chain. Now, just bringing that home in terms of particular sectors, if we can go and talk about reshoring, if anything, what we're going to find is that a lot of reshoring politics is going to go on, but it's going to affect those things that are closer to home, that affect the livelihood of consumers in the developed world. And the livelihood of consumers is affected by food, pharmaceutical, medical equipment. That's what's going to affect the voters in the developed world. And so if anything, that's going to focus developed nations to speed up the reshoring of production in those areas. Now, it may not be they move production away from China. It may be they expand production in the USA, in Europe, in Australia. I don't see the total production of masks going down in China. I see that production capacity is going to stay there, and I see there'll be more production capacity in the future being opening up in the USA, in Europe, and Australia. Okay, so there's just going to be a greater expansion of capacity. So, you know, there's going to be some reshoring. If anything, the reshoring is going to happen in the pharmaceutical, and if anything, it's going to happen more so in the food area. There's going to be a greater attention to, okay, what are we growing locally? We need to protect what we're growing locally and not be too reliant on importing food from other countries, especially now when air capacity is at its lowest for 1 or 2 decades. You know, freight capacity, air freight. You know, a lot of cold storage food is freighted around in the bottom of passenger aircraft. Okay, and you know that's not there now. And so, you know, these are the challenges about reshoring politics. So, you know, I don't see, you know, reshoring. I don't see, you know, moving away from China as a big deal in the long term, because the whole demand, especially in the area of pharmaceutical medical equipment, is just going to double and triple anyway, and it's going to stay that way for a long time to come, even after we get a vaccine, and that may not happen for another 12 months anyway. Who knows when? Okay, so that's, you know, my take on what's going on in terms of the long term. We can also talk, you know, I've actually put it into another graph here I just want to show you. You know, we can see reshoring in terms of, okay, reshoring is going to affect the products that maybe have a short life cycle. That means you have to get things to market very, very quickly. Okay, so if the total cost of product in the USA is $10 US and in China it ends up being 8.5, then it's likely to, you know, be reshored. But if anything, what's going to happen in the USA and in Europe and Australia over the next 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, and in some cases even sooner, there's going to be much more inflation of non-essential items. You go into a dollar store, those thrifty shops in the developed world, where, you know, $1 US store you can buy lots of things, that's going to turn into a $2 US store or a $3 US store, because things are not going to be as cheap as they have been for the last decade. You know, these stores are usually populated with goods from China anyway. It's not going to go back to what it was before the trade war, or back in 2017. Inflation is going to occur. Things that are going to stay in China, if we're talking about, let's just look at the next one. If we, you know, products that require labor-intensive manufacturing process, complicated apparel. I just mentioned, you know, the high-end designer labels like Lee and Wangda, you know, VF Corp, made in China. They'll still continue to be made in China because the skilled labor is there. Complicated electronic assembly will still remain in China because the ecosystem is still there. What about moving to Vietnam? Maybe, but Vietnam doesn't have that ecosystem. And in some product segments, Vietnam still imports a lot of materials from China anyway. So it doesn't make sense to move a factory to Vietnam just because you want to avoid 15% or 20% tariffs. If a majority of the goods are coming from China and being reassembled in Vietnam, you're going to be challenged by importing it into the USA anyway, and you might be put a tariff on that China component of those imported goods. So it doesn't make sense for that purpose. In the end, where China has strong ecosystems, especially in Zhejiang province, the home of Alibaba, south of Shanghai, and especially in Shenzhen, Guangdong province, in electronic components, that's not going to go away, and that's going to be there for a long time to come, and pretty safe in that regard. Okay, other countries. Okay, can we move from China to Southeast Asia? So I've given you some examples from that. Yes, if there's no need for a strong ecosystem, like, for example, we talk about Vietnam, like, I have been living in Malaysia for 3 years. Malaysia were, very good, probably pretty strong in the area of the industry in plastics, and more higher end electronics around Penang, but Malaysia can replace factories in China when it comes to plastic mold making, like toys, playground equipment. They're made out of plastics. Yes, because Malaysia has raw materials for plastics, big giant plastic industry in Malaysia. If there's no need for speed to market, so it takes weeks it takes many a week or more to ship from one country to another. It takes a long time, but if you want speed to market, then you've got to think differently about where you're locating your factory. Like your factories in Turkey, one of the largest white good manufacturers in the world is located in Turkey, and it's perfectly located there for shipping into Europe rather than shipping from China into Europe. So that being close to the market is very, very important in that way. Longer product cycles and low value goods. So, China still is going to have an advantage for the most part. And so it's only going to be certain product segments that we're going to worry about. What I've done here is made a list of top 10 post-COVID-19 trends, and like this list is being updated with knowledge and as we go, but for the most part I reckon about 8 of these items on the list is still relevant today as we speak. And there's a few items I'll add to the end here, but just summarizing a few things here, and we can talk about any one of these items. I'm happy to take questions. That is, number one, under supply management. The consolidation of suppliers, okay, like that started over 5 years ago. That will continue, the consolidation of suppliers. The multinationals have been consolidating for a while now. If anything, the consolidation is going to speed up in terms of the color variety, in terms of little bottles that hold your sanitizer. And so, maybe in 2019, you made these bottles, but there were 6 different colors. Well, now what's going to happen is people are not going to care about buying the bottle for the color. They're going to buy the bottle because of what's inside, and the bottle is the right shape. And so now you're going to make one color instead of 5 different colors. So that's what we mean by consolidation. So there's going to be consolidation of suppliers. You're going to have fewer suppliers, but also you're going to consolidate the actual SKUs that you are sourcing from any one particular supplier. And that's going to help manage the costs of the sourcing in the supply chain. There's going to be a greater attention to second and third tier suppliers. Now that's already started to occur. The fashion and apparel industry have been aware of that for some time now, because of social pressures to show that they are aware of the social compliance of their first-tier supplier factories. But not only that, their second-tier supplier factories, the fabric mills, and also, the third-tier suppliers, or the cotton, where the cotton comes from, are they picked by underage labour and things like that? This transparency has been going on for, over nearly a decade in some industry sectors. That's going to occur in more sectors after post-COVID. There'll be greater attention will be given to conducting disruption, risk, or stress tests. And for the last 5 or 10 years, in some sectors, multinationals have started to have someone in charge of environmental risk or environmental social responsibility, and that's been pushed by the GRE, the triple bottom line reporting that's come out of Europe. And, it's required a greater awareness of the quarterly reporting, not just report the balance sheet, the cash flow and the profit statement, but also reporting the materiality risk with regard to environmental and social compliance. Well, and so, multinationals for a dozen years now have actually had someone at the C manager level in charge of that. What I'm going to see post-COVID is that someone at that level is going to be in charge of that supply chain risk if there wasn't someone there 18 months ago. Greater attention will be given to certification and compliance of factories in some developing countries. Now, we see that already as a result of pressure coming out of Europe, because if you're shipping into Europe and if any one country finds that your goods is not in compliant with a certain regulation, they can immediately post a notice of non-compliance, and that notice will demand a recall of that product from all of the EU states, from all of the EU countries immediately. And it goes onto a website. You go to the website and you see that. And that's happening today as we speak. We're going to see that pressure even going to be greater post-COVID-19, especially in certain sectors, definitely in the area of PPE. Okay, so that's in terms of supplier management. And, that pressure of certification compliance is being pushed onto the factories. You as an importer of record into Europe now, you will not be able to take the risk of bringing inventory into Europe and not knowing that your factory is not compliant. That is a huge risk that no importer of record is going to take. At the moment, importer of records have been taking that risk, and that's something that that's a risk that they're going to take to a lesser degree in the future. Supply location. SMEs will continue to reassess factory moves and delay investment, because really, okay, when you move, like when GoPro moved from China to Southeast Asia, yes, it does take a while to move the factory and re-equip and reset up and actually get working again. Like for them, for electronics, it may take a matter of weeks, but it's a huge investment to get that infrastructure set up very, very quickly, and you can do that. But for other sectors, it may take even longer. And, that's assuming that you already have a supply base to actually source from, relationships that you can work with in that new country that you trust. You trust the material suppliers, and you trust various other equipment suppliers that are giving you equipment for that new factory. Wow. So MMCs will consider redesigns to reduce dependence on particular countries. So, they're particular redesigns. So I don't need as much plastic, or I don't need as much metal inside my smartphone or something like that. Then I don't need to supply of a certain material. Number 7, onshoring of the manufacture of PPE. We've actually talked about that. Number 8, diversification of sourcing, especially pharmaceuticals and food. So I talked about that as part of that, the politics of onshoring. Then we go on to compliance regulations for importers of record. Factories in China will consolidate in order to manage the pressures from global buyers. Generally, like I've seen some consolidation of factories in China, but for the most part, factories are generally family owned, especially the SME factories, and they don't have an inkling to consolidate in as a way of surviving. It's more likely that they'll close down the assembly, they'll still offer their products, and then they'll outsource their assembly to another larger factory. And that other large factory would become the OEM supplier for the original factory that closed down, and then the owner of the original factory just becomes a seller of a particular brand. So I could see that trend happening, and in some ways that's a consolidation. But in the West, what would tend to happen when you're facing these cost pressures, you may not do that. It's more likely that you may merge with another factory. You get bigger to become stronger. You get bigger to take greater advantages of the scale, the economies of scale, because you can make a larger volume. That's not always the first go-to option when we talk about Chinese factories. Okay, number 10, there's a greater push for making online investment platforms to take greater responsibility for substandard and non-compliant products sold in developed nations. So, at the moment, you could see that the EU is trying to make Amazon platform to be responsible for non-compliant products that are actually marketed on the platform. Even if they're not sold, if they're marketed on that platform, you're responsible for any inventory that's associated with that item. And if it becomes non-compliant, then all of that inventory is non-compliant and needs to be disposed of. And the importer of record associated with that inventory has to take responsibility for the ethical disposal of that inventory. At the moment, the importer of record is responsible for that, but the EU is pushing to make Amazon also responsible for that. So therefore, Amazon would actually stop importer of records for putting products to be advertised on their sales platform in the first place. This is a trend. This is something that is, gathering pace at the moment. It's not officially in place, but it's something that the EU wants to do. Wow. Now, is there anything else that has happened that, I could add to this top 10 or could replace some of the top 10? I think number one would be that I think what has happened is there's been a huge loss of trust among suppliers, especially in third world, in China, of brand name buyers, because a lot of brand name buyers decided to just stop ordering. Said, oh, sorry, we don't order anymore. We can't order because we've got no demand for our products. And an example is a factory in Bangladesh that made shoes for Bata and Hush puppies, and suddenly they just stopped ordering from them, and suddenly this factory has just got tons of inventory that they can't sell, or when they do sell, they're going to sell it at a loss. And that's a huge loss of trust, because there is a kind of a product roadmap that brand names have with their suppliers. They share with their suppliers, and it's part of the relationship that there is a kind of ongoing order system coming from the buyer. But what has happened in the last 6 months is a lot of brand name buyers have actually cut off their orders immediately from the suppliers, and so there's going to be a lot of relationship repair that will have to take place post-COVID, and some relationships may not be able to be repaired. I think that's going to be a top 10 thing that could replace one of these. One more thing is teams have, around the world, especially sourcing teams, There's a question has come on, and I'll go to questions shortly. Teams have learnt to be more efficient online. We're forced to be online, but in some ways, we have learnt how to be more efficient in working together online. It's become a necessity, and I think post-COVID, that will continue. We won't all go back to an offline working system to where we were in 2019. So let me just stop there, and I think I've just added to some of these top 10, and there's some other issues here we can talk about, but let me just stop there and have a look at some of the questions that are coming up in the chat room. And so, first of all, we've got Jess. Do you think there'll be a significant unwinding of globalization will reduce the over demand of factory capacity in low cost countries? I think, okay, number one, this is going to be sector dependent. For example, you talk about PPE, and face masks is a huge area of PPE. That's not going to go down. The global demand for PPE is going to stay there, but they're going to expand capacity in other countries. In other words, from now onwards, PPE is just going to get larger. Okay, so China went from making 50% of the demand for PPE to 75%. Maybe that will go back to 50%, but the total demand worldwide for PPE is just going to be larger for a long time to come. Okay, so even and the reason why China goes from 75% down to 50% again, it's because the pie gets larger. It's not because capacity in China is actually closing down. In other areas, in electronics, that's not going to diminish because a lot of electronics is just so well efficiently made. Consumer electronics continues to be efficiently made in China. And as much as we can pound the table in the USA saying that we need to reshore electronics manufacturing in the USA, the only area where that's going to happen is where you can have a lot of robotics. And for consumer electronics, robotics isn't the first area of, I guess, inefficiency or re-engineering that occurs. The first area where you want to bring in robotics is more in the heavier area of manufacturing, like motor vehicles. What I've seen in terms of automation occurring at consumer electronics, if anything, has been in the testing of electronic equipment. And so when HTC put robotics into their smartphone assembly line, they didn't put it in the assembly of their smartphones, they put it in the testing of the smartphone after it was assembled. Okay, the dominant assembly of iPhones is still done by labor, not robotics, but the actual testing of the iPhones is done by robotics. So if you go and start manufacturing iPhones in the USA and try to use with robotics, I don't think it pays off for doing that. And that's why you see Apple now working to expand its production capacity in India to export to the USA. And they see that as a more efficient strategy than manufacturing in the USA for the USA. So if the answer to your question is a sector by sector answer. PPE, is one thing happening. Electronics. If we talk about garments, well, China and India, they have the world's largest supply of cotton, and so it doesn't make sense that they are going to be any have any smaller capacity of manufacturing garments than they have now. You're not going to ship cotton to the USA because you want to manufacture garments in the USA. You're going to locate factories close to where the raw materials are. So the global supply chains are not going to change to that huge degree because of COVID. What is going to change, if anything, is how you manage the supply chain. So I think one huge innovation is now we're going to have much more virtual management of the supply chain. So Pivot 88 is an example of what I've talked about here. And just finish up and answering that question, then we go to the next question. Pivot 88, and it's just an example. They create a digitalized tablet that you input at the factory stage, and so therefore the actual owner of the supply chain on the other side of the world can actually see quality gate by quality gate in the factory how the product is being manufactured, and they can pull out different areas where there's a quality control problem and then fix that, and by the time you get to the end and do the final QC, you don't have major rejects. And they've had success with this new model, and that doesn't require people from the developed country company to be on the ground in the factory in China. Okay, do you think, yeah, I'm open for more questions, please. Don't let me talk for too long without more questions. Just ring fencing what I was just talking about, in this Pivot 88 is, this is a local Hong Kong company, by the way, established in Hong Kong a decade ago, and, they're one of the major companies now providing this real-time software. And of course, there are problems with putting details into the tablet in the factory, like garbage in, garbage out. But they're getting people that are using this system are getting benefits with faster updates in what's happening on the factory floor in terms of the product assembly process, and faster updates. And at the same time, they're getting benefits because the people that are putting this data in are actually learning to be more aware of problems as they occur, because they're in charge. They are tasked with, putting in the data, and the tablet requires them to put in specific data and not what they think is actually happening on the assembly line. And so it's easier for them to put in a specific data at the quality gate in an early stage of sewing a particular garment. If there's a small problem in sewing the pocket, and how many of those problems occurred in the morning session, and then you type that in. There was 100 pockets sewn and 3 pockets weren't sewn correctly, then you put 3 out of 100 into the tablet, and then that becomes an indelible record. And so, at any one time, the people observing this system overseas can actually stop that system or ask for those items to be pulled from the assembly line before they actually go to the end, where the final QC will pull them anyway. But when those garments get to the end and the final QC pulls that garment, there's much more costs of labor have been added to that garment. And then when you pull items right at the end by QC, then it costs much more in terms of rework, or those garments are no longer useful. But if a pocket is improperly sewn, it may be able to be fixed, or the rework done, mid-production, and then it can go back into the assembly line. And that way, people through this tablet in getting real-time updates and actually training the people on the floor in the factory, they're tasked with putting in these real-time updates, we find that this pressure to have these virtual updates is actually happening, not helping not just the factory to do better, but it's also giving greater confidence to people who own these supply chains in other countries to actually manage those supply chains from a distance. So I think, this is a big trend that I've also, recently witnessed that's happening, and this is an example coming out of Hong Kong. Wilfred, thank you for your wonderful question here. I understand the demand for certain products, such as face masks, will not reduce, but will countries try to have their own production capacity instead of relying on manufacturing in low-cost countries? Yes, they will, but I can tell you now the demand will exceed supply for years to come, even if they ramp up supply in the USA, even if they ramp up supply in Australia, in the EU, the demand is still going to be much higher than supply. This is something that is much bigger than SARS. This is something where the whole world is getting a lesson in hygiene. Okay, so it's not just face masks. The whole area, the whole sanitization industry is going to get a reboot in terms of the whole world awareness of continuing to practice hygiene, continuing to have spare face masks, even in 12 months, 2 years, 3 years' time, when there is a vaccine available, the world will continue to have inventory. So for now, you have your kitchen cabinet. Every kitchen cabinet in the developed world for the last 3 decades has had a packet of Band-Aids. They've had a packet of Panadol. They've had a packet of something, some Dettol. They've had a packet of something else. Now, from now onwards, they're going to have a box of 50 face masks. All right, and so you multiply the kitchen cabinets around the world in the developed world by one box of 50 face masks, and that's going to go on. That's beyond the vaccine, and that's going to continue. All right, so this capacity is going to be much larger than even what it is currently. And, that's good news. That's good news for thinking. Just another demand like cold storage. One more thing, we're talking about, what's going to be in supply and demand. And, this may affect your investment decisions that you make. Cold storage, just think when they get a vaccine that, maybe a vaccine comes in 3 months' time. Maybe it comes at the end of the year. Maybe it comes early next year or middle of next year. When it comes, the whole world, we're going to have to ship. You're talking about hundreds of millions of vials of this vaccine. And when you ship vaccine, you need cold storage. You need cold storage containers. You need cold storage containers that go on airlines if you ship by air. You need cold storage containers on land if they are shipped by land transport. So the whole cold storage industry is going to grow because we have to ship vaccines now, and that's going to go on for years to come. It's not just going to happen all at once. So things are going to linger. We're not going to go back to 2019 in 12 or 18 months' time, especially in the PPE area sector, face masks, vaccines, in many sectors. The demand is just going to be large for years to come. I know it's near the end. I'm happy just to finish up this. Please, you're welcome to contact me. The email is in the PowerPoint slides. You can contact me at Neale, Neale, @ricebox.com. Happy to field your questions, or field any advice that you're looking for. I'm always giving pro bono advice to factories and even people that are got sourcing questions from overseas. I'm always doing this. Happy to help. Thank you.
Hi, Professor. If you want, you can go through the next slide, or you want to stop now?
Oh, I can happy to go.
Yeah, please, you can.
Yeah. Well, I'll just give you the example of Pivot 88 here, and that's the tablet that they are using. There's other questions that people have asked, and just extending what we were talking about. We all want to know about the future. Like, if we can predict the future, then we can better manage the risks that we face, right? Well, someone could ask, when was last time we were hit economically? How does it compare? We can talk about 1915 with, the Spanish flu, or World War I. That's where we're looking back, where we were hit greatest economically, 100 years ago. What were the difference between the previous economic downturn compared to this one, and the hardest hit industry? Well, here's the 10 global biggest industries by revenue. So let's have a look at this. The top one is service. In some ways, that's only going to get larger. Pension funds, that's going to bounce back, and it has bounced back. Car and automobile sales, that's going to go more into the electrical vehicle area. China by 2025 will be making 5 million electric automobiles per year, whereas USA will only be making 500,000. So, China is just going to go from strength to strength in terms of automobile manufacturing. Commercial real estate, in some way, that is probably going to be the largest hit globally, because more and more things are going to go online. Now, yes, you might say for the last 5 years, things have been going online, but here's the difference. Here's the big difference between 12 months ago and today. In the last 6 months, probably 30% of the population in the developed world never ever went online to buy something, and they have gone online to buy something for the very first time in their life. And once they have done that, they have crossed that threshold. They've crossed that trust threshold. Do I trust an online vendor? Well, once they get past that trust of, can I buy shoes online? Will they fit me? Can I buy a dress online? Will it fit? Once they get past that trust barrier, that question, they're not going to go into a store in 6 months' time. And that's 30% more of people that are going to be buying online that weren't buying online 6 months ago in the developed world. So that's going to have a huge knock-on effect for commercial real estate, because people are not going to walk into the store to try on clothes, to try on shoes. Let's have a look at the next one. Global car and automobile manufacturing, it's always going to grow. Global direct general insurance carriers. And I would say the next biggest thing would be global tourism. That's going to be worst hit out of the top 10. It's already hit now, and that's not going to recover anytime soon. That's going to take two, 3 more years to recover. And so that's the biggest takeaway when you go through that top 10 list. Should businesses prepare themselves for the future in case a similar outbreak happens? Of course. In some ways, preparing in terms of having safety equipment, PPE, preparing in terms of having a second way of working in teams. We're very experienced working with teams. Maybe from now on in the future, if we go back to normal, we will have once a month an online team meeting instead of having a face-to-face team meeting. In the university system, maybe we go back to face-to-face teaching in 12 months' time because students like that. But maybe for 1 or 2 weeks in every semester following, we actually have online material. Maybe from now on, and I think it's going to be incumbent on all universities to have video copies of all material provided for all lectures in any one semester. And so we could actually switch to online overnight, or to provide both online and offline mediums of teaching, even though students prefer offline. All right. What business model is best during the outbreak? Of course, the business model at the moment has been working with having online teams meeting every week. And, in some ways, we actually meet more frequently when we're online because we have to have more frequent touch points when we are online versus when we are face-to-face, because information gets distorted, information gets lost in some ways. We think we are digitalizing information, but we don't always understand the meaning behind what we are digitizing when we are giving instructions behind certain orders in a hierarchy or in a team. Okay, the business model that works best during this outbreak at the moment, in some ways, is the online business model. So, there are some questions that have been asked in the past in my network. And so that takes me to the end of tonight's session. I think, the exploration of the future and what we've done in the last 15 or 20 minutes in helping with your questions, and actually me posting some of my own questions here, I think helps us to think about the future. It's only going to global supply chains are only going to get larger. We're not moving from China to other countries. China's only going to get larger, but also the actual onshoring, and that is capacity on certain sectors, is only going to get larger in the developed world as well. So that's the new reality, and I'll just hold it there, and happy to take email from you and to connect with you from this night onwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. We have now come to the end of this webinar. The link of the webinar recording will be provided to you 2 to 3 working days after the event. Thank you very much for joining us today, and hope you have enjoyed this session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye all. Thank you very much.
Bye.
I'll talk to you in email.